So let's talk about assessing students. And so our training objectives for this session are going to be able to identify and assess functional academics, learn effective assessment strategies, begin the portfolio process, and create a plan for getting started. So when we just talked about the arrow of implementation, excuse me. So we're going to assess each student, and then we're going to begin the portfolio process. So we're at the beginning of our arrow. So remember, both programs contain an assessment component over here, and then you have your curriculum over here. Your assessment components are black spined, and we're only going to focus on the assessment component right now. The instructional strategies and overreaching purposes are different between the assessment and the curriculum. In this portion, you're only assessing at this point, not teaching. And the areas, activities, and assessment exercise are for placement purposes only. And this is something, sometimes it's a little hard to wrap your head around because we're so used to teaching with our students every day and you know, giving them extra chances and or maybe giving them an extra cue to help them get the correct answer. And with the assessment, you're not doing that at all. There is no giving them a second try. They know it or they don't. And that's something that I noticed in Kent. I had the opportunity to do training with paraeducators. And that one was really hard for them to kind of wrap their head around, just because they were so in teaching mode from doing it every day. And so it's really important to differentiate that this portion we are assessing, we are not teaching. Okay, for this section of the training, you will need your assessment teacher's manual, which is this guy, and a student assessment book, okay? You're not going to need your testing kit at this point, just because we're not going to have time to practice assessing, although I highly recommend that if you have the opportunity, or if you're sitting with a partner today during this training, when we get done practicing assessing with each other. It just helps the final experience when you're doing assessing with students. It helps it flow smoother if you've had opportunity to practice. Your assessment is designed to do two things: determine skill level and develop individual functional academic programs. Okay, it is not to provide a standardized score. It's, when I was first learning it, I thought, you know, when I was first doing it, I was like, oh, this is a placement test, right? It's kind of like a placement test. Like, you know, gen ed teachers do placement tests for students in reading curriculums, right? This is kind of the same thing. It's our placement test for this curriculum. So the student assessment follows the student through grade levels. It provides initial and follow-up assessments. Really, you should only have to assess your students once, you know, because like I said, it's a placement test. Now, there are scenarios where it would happen where you might need to assess them another time, and that's why we give or provide the follow-up assessment. You know, if a student has had a catastrophic event, like maybe they were in the hospital for 3 months and they came back, and you just want to get a quick look at, are they still where they were when they left? You can do the additional assessment. Another thing to think about is some districts use this assessment as a way of showing progress for, or lack of progress for extended school year participation. And so that's why the follow-up is there. I've also seen teachers use the assessment and do it more than once. Especially when they were doing it with the ESY, extended school year component, where they're trying they're assessing them every June to see have we made progress. How they did it was the first assessment they'd put the date, and then they'd do it in pencil. And then when they went to do the second assessment, they put the date and do it in blue ink. And then if they decide they need to assess again, they'd put the date and do it in green ink so they could differentiate. But truly, you should only need to assess them once, as I said before, because this really is a placement test for the curriculum. We talked about this a little bit already. Your assessment kit provides nearly all of the materials needed to administer the assessment. It gives you blank name cards, half hours, hours, lowercase, uppercase. It gives you all that stuff. You can put it together in your little kit. The materials they don't include are an analog or digital clock, a calculator, real coins, pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, and bills, push button phones or cell phones, and then also devices. Some folks look at that with analog clock and they're like, why are we doing analog clock? I mean, that was the first question I asked Suzanne when I got an opportunity to go to a training with her, is like, why are we doing analog? Because most buildings have digital clocks on the wall. And she pointed out, she said, well, number one, not all buildings have digital clocks on the wall, but more importantly, analog clocks are a way to show movement of time, very visual for students to see that time moves, whereas digital clocks don't do that. And so that's why they're doing analog and digital clock. And you know, all these things are fairly easy to find and just throw into your test kit, or you know, having a little bin with the test kit. Some people ask about the money. Why real money? Well, because I have yet to see fake money, especially coins, that felt the same, that smelled the same, that looked the same as real money. And so whenever possible, use the real thing. Some people get a little freaked out about bills, and I understand that because we don't have a lot of money. We're teachers. So I've seen there are bills within the masters, and I think they're also on the thumb drive. You can print them off, and they're not exactly there. They come out cut out the correct size, but they're actually a little smaller than what you cut out. And you can run those off. And there's also ways to weather those to make them feel more like real money. I've known teachers to run them off and cut them out and put them in like a pillowcase in the dryer for a couple minutes with a tennis ball to beat them up and get them to feel a little bit more like cloth money. But anyway, those are the materials you're going to want to add to your test kit. The assessment teacher's manual includes, basically it's going to tell you how to conduct your assessment and determining the present levels of performance for the student, and then the appropriate placement in each curriculum content area. So your assessment guide. The assessment guide in the front of the teacher's manual is only a few pages long, but it provides pertinent, helpful information needed in order for you to be able to assess your students. I highly recommend reading this. We don't have time today to do that, but it's going to be very helpful for you to give you ideas about how you're going to do this in your classroom. And it's just kind of forewarning you about things you want to think about and look at. So I highly recommend reading that. Your assessment is sequenced and present levels of performance. So the assessment is sequenced from the easiest skill to the hardest skill. And the assessment will tell you when to stop assessing each skill area and what skills to assess next. Okay, if you suspect that your student might be at a higher skill level than what he's showing or he or she is showing on the assessment, you can continue to assess that area. Use your judgment. They're your student. You know them best, right? So testing guidelines. Student assessment so when you look at your testing guidelines here, they have these highlighted areas on this slide. It tells you student assessment. It provides a corresponding page in the student assessment book. Materials list, it lists the specific testing kit materials needed in order to assess this area. It gives you directions, including additional instructions. It gives you testing tips, providing helpful hints for this assessment. It gives you follow-up assessment. It gives the page you will find the follow-up assessment on in the student assessment book. Things to note on the materials. Notice how the materials list connects directly to the assessment testing kit materials. So this one says you're going to need timesheet and day cards. And then you go to your testing kit and you pull out timesheet and day cards, which should be under that assessment area. When you look at assessment details, it gives you your goal, explains the goal of this assessment section. What are we doing? The instruction gives you the exact instruction to use when you're assessing your students. The response tells you the desired student response. Scoring explains how to score the section of the assessment. Determining present levels of performance, PLOP level, and next steps tells you what to mark on the present levels of performance and what you're going to assess next. And then it gives you also a sample student assessment. It's filled out for you to look at and see what it should look like. So here's a sample assessment. So this one's for recognizing letters and sounds. So you're going to assess uppercase first. Then you're going to assess lowercase. Then you're going to assess sounds. Okay. Hold on here. There's a comment in chat. Okay, so a question from Eddie and Kevin. At which point should teachers administer reassessment? And so I talked about that a little bit. For instance, if you were going to use it for this assessment for extended school year, then at the end of the year, you would reassess the students. So if you're assessing them now, right, then I would assess them at the end of the year. Because then you can show whether there's been growth or not, or if there has been lack of growth, right? Another thing, like I talked about also was, you know, if the student has recently moved to a different school, you might want to do a quick little reassessment to see, are they still where they're at? That's totally up to you, because if you get this student moving in and they already have these materials, you could just start them where they left off. I mean, that too is going to tell you whether or not they're still where they need to be. So really, it's up to your judgment as to when you want to administer reassessments. Thanks, guys. So back to the sample assessment. What I love about this is that it gives you the formula at the bottom of what you're going to do to figure out your percentages. Everything's there. You just fill in the blanks. Things to note on scoring. You're going to record scores directly on the individual student assessment book, because remember, each student has their own assessment book, and that's going to travel with their data book and their portfolio with them across the grades, right? After you complete the assessment, refer to the determining present levels of performance and next steps, right? And then on the PLOP chart, and the PLOP chart, let me show you really quick. So I'm looking at functional reading. This is a secondary book. I'm looking at functional reading, and here's the PLOP chart. That is at the beginning of the assessment area. So you're going to do your assessment and record your answers and your percentage here. Then you're going to flip back here and report it here on your present levels of performance chart, okay? In general, the rule is to circle correct responses and mark a line through incorrect responses when you're doing assessment. The overall score is used for determining the present levels of performance. And then when you look at the bottom down there where the little orange arrow is, it says it tells you where you're going to go next. So this student on this test 3 quarter hours got 80% accuracy. So now when you look below that, it says test 3, 80% or more correct. You're going to mark PLOP level 4 on the present levels of performance chart, which is on the next slide. I'll show you in just a second. And then you're going to go to test 4 in this section. That's where they want you to start assessing next. So it tells you where to go. So we were just talking about the present levels of performance level. This is the chart you're going to fill out that's at the beginning of that assessment section. And this basically tells you exactly what to mark on the present levels of performance at the beginning of each section. Okay. This one's for identifying name and it's elementary. So it lists all the areas that are going to be assessed or could be assessed, and then what to do and where to go when you get your percent accuracy on the assessment. Okay. There's also a curriculum flow chart, and we will discuss this at length in the next session, but I want you to be aware of this component as it is a key component in the curriculum. This is found at the end of each assessment content area and at the beginning of each curriculum content area. And basically it's on the left is present levels of performance, and on the right are the curriculum and lessons. And like I said, we'll go over this more in the next PowerPoint, but it tells you if you're at this PLOP, present levels of performance on the left, then it tells you where to go in the lesson plan and what data sheet to pull. And it'll be more clear in the next PowerPoint, so bear with me. So assessment strategies, reinforcement. Make the testing environment a positive one. Use reinforcement to motivate students without reinforcing a particular response. So appropriate reinforcement would be, good job paying attention, or you're trying very hard, that is good, or I like how you're sitting like a 4th grader. Inappropriate reinforcement during assessment would be, yes, that is the right answer, or nope, that's wrong. I don't know about you, but if I'd have said that during assessment with one of my students, with many of my students, materials would have started flying at me. Just remember to reinforce what they're doing, appropriately as far as paying attention. Don't tell them if they're right or wrong with their answer, but try to reinforce that good behavior and attention. Making the testing environment a positive one motivates students without reinforcing a particular answer or a response. Instructions and prompts. So each section of the assessment accommodates students that are both verbal and nonverbal. So when we're looking at this slide, the highlighted areas for instruction on this one, for a verbal student, you're going to place a clock card in front of the student, point to the time on the card and ask, what time is it? For nonverbal students, for the same skill, you're going to present the student with 3 cards and say, show me 1 o'clock. Pick up the cards after each response and present 3 new cards in new positions, and you're going to randomize the order in which you ask the times. So it tells you exactly how to present it for verbal kids and nonverbal kids. And then it also gives you the responses that you should be getting from verbal students or nonverbal students. Additional instructions and prompting. So answers should be recorded as incorrect if you need to prompt beyond the given instruction. So if I say, what letter? Well, maybe that's not good. Okay, let's do a different one. So I have a nonverbal student and I say, give them a field of 3 and I say, find the letter A. And they start reaching for letter B, but I lean a little bit towards letter A. I'm kind of cueing them, right? the idea is to make sure you're testing whether the student possesses the skill, not whether the student understands the instruction. So if you have students with mobility issues, they may not be able to match based on the position of materials, especially, if they're, they don't have any access, if they're not able to use their hands. So you're going to want to adjust the way materials are presented, and you have the wherewithal within this assessment to do this. You might narrow the choices. You might present them at midline or not at midline. Hold them up instead of placing them on the table. Go through them again. If a student is still unable to match colors or letters, mark the assessment as incorrect. You basically just don't want, you want to be certain that you are testing whether the student possesses skill, not whether the student understands a question or can physically perform the task, right? So if you have to present things to a particular student on a slant, that's okay. You're going to have to adjust it for their needs. So you can give additional prompting or instructions. You just want to make sure you're testing their skill level, not their accessibility level. Inadvertent prompting. You want to be careful of not doing that. I talked about that a little bit, watching what your body is doing and your face is doing while you're doing assessments. Our kids are very astute at reading body language and reading us. And so, you have to be careful about where your eyes are when you're doing the assessment, and that when they're reaching for the wrong answer, that don't have your eyes on the correct answer, so they'll switch. So just be aware that inadvertent prompting happens, and that you want to be careful and not do that. One way to do it is I've had I've worked with teams where the teacher was practicing with her paras, and she might be a teacher of one para and the other paras are watching. And it really helps each other when they can be in that kind of situation, because they can see, oh, you were leaning towards the answer for, when you ask the student to find the letter, you were kind of leaning towards it. That could have been inadvertent prompting. So it's something to kind of talk about and be aware of. It's a great thing to practice not inadvertently prompting if you have the opportunity with your paras and peers. Next is the assessment video. We talked about this earlier. We don't really have time for this today, I'm sorry to say, but if you get onto the website and sign in and become a member, you will have access to session 3 using the Styer-Fitzgerald Functional Academics Assessment, and I really highly recommend watching this. It's just another reiteration of what we're doing right here, but it also gives you some great visuals, and it's a great tool to use with paraeducators for a reference later or for a training opportunity later with them. Getting started with students, review each section of the assessment. Determine whether you are going to give the entire assessment to each student or break it down into parts. This is really important because not all of our kids are going to be able to sit through a whole assessment. And let's be honest, they might be able to sit through one assessment area per day. And you have that prerogative with this curriculum and this assessment. You know your students best. It's up to you to figure out how much they're going to be able to handle per assessment section. So it's something to think about. I would say try assessing one student first, probably your easiest student to assess. And then it'll help you get your feet under yourself and also be able to figure out and judge how you're going to roll this out. You're going to determine which areas you're going to assess first. You don't have, when I'm looking at the assessments, the student's assessment book, the first area is functional reading. If you don't want to start doing functional reading with your assessing, then don't. Start with the area that makes the most sense for you. Some districts I have worked with in the past have determined, we're going to roll this out in a graduated way, so we're only going to do the math skills first. We'll assess all the kids in math, and then we'll go from there, and we'll get the programs up and running, and then we'll decide, then maybe functional reading will be next, and we'll assess that area, and we'll get those programs up and running. I know when I was in the Kent School District, when we rolled this out, we decided, we rolled it out to transition program before school started, so the minute school started, they could start assessing their students and get them in the curriculum. And then the next group that we rolled it out to was the middle school and high school students, or teachers. And then we decided that we'd bring in the elementary towards like January. The other thing we did also was we set assessment dates for them, so, or time periods. So like with transition group, we trained them in the end of August, and our expectation, the district's expectation, was that all assessing would be done by the end of October. And then when we in October, when we rolled it out to the middle school, high school folks, the expectation was by midwinter break that we would have all the assessment done for them. So it's really up to you and your district to decide how that's going to work. So yeah, it's definitely a conversation worth having. Another thing to determine is who will administer the assessment sections. Some teachers are not comfortable at all with having paras run assessment. Other teachers, you know, it just depends on you and your program. I had been in a classroom for a long time. My staff were highly trained. There were, out of 5 staff, there were 2 that I didn't feel were going to be successful with assessing. So what we did was 3 of them I determined we're going to be able to assess, and I assigned them sections that they were going to assess. Like, you're going to do functional, you're going to do time management, you're going to do independent skills, and then I'm going to do the rest. You know, it's up to you. If you're going to have paras running assessment, then they're going to need training. And so then it's figuring out, how are we going to do that? I know some districts have early release or late arrival days. And you might be able to take some of that time. I know in our district, our administrators were very, they wanted that time for their training. So it was kind of a tussle to try to get that time to work with paras. I know, you know, at times when I was at the district level, classrooms would bring me in to do spot training with paras on those early release, late arrival days, where I would work with them on administering assessment and practicing on those days. So it's up to you and whatever's going to work in your district. And then again, I talked a little bit already about determining assessment schedules and timelines. That's totally up to you and your district about how you're going to do that. I explained how we did it in Kent. I know other districts, you know, set, okay, all assessment on these 3 areas need to be done by this date. It's just whatever's, you know, the expectation where you're at. For this section of the training, we're going to talk about your the student portfolio. So you might want to pull out your student portfolio manual, and then a binder, one of the binders for your student portfolios. And if you don't have the binders, that's fine, because really we're going to talk about mostly the teacher manual. We've talked a little bit about how you set up the student portfolio, that you have the face page, the student's name is going to be on that, the spine, the student name is going to be on that, and you put it in a binder. You have tabs in the binder, and that's where you're going to put your components of your portfolio as you start putting them together. Reading the portfolio teacher's manual, it's an easy read and well worth it. It will provide some much needed direction for how to set up a meaningful student portfolio. Highly recommend reading your manual. There's components. They're a little bit different depending on if you're in elementary or secondary. The biggest difference is secondary, they have vocational added to the components, and independent transition plan also. So all these different areas are areas that you can put information under in your portfolio about your student. And so when you're looking at this, it's pretty comprehensive, and you could see how this could easily flow into a person-centered plan if your student has one of those, because it kind of goes hand in hand with that. Using your provided forms, each section of the portfolio provides forms to get you started. All forms are explained in the portfolio teacher's manual, and then additional portfolio suggestions are also included. And we also talked about these are on the thumb drive and they are modifiable. Become familiar with the portfolio forms. Involve related service providers. These forms are intended to encourage collaboration between various IEP team members in order for the students to truly learn to communicate, transfer independently, or learn to navigate the community independently, and the entire team working together to ensure things like communication are embedded throughout the day, all day, and not just for 30 to 90 minutes per week. Because let's be real, 30 to 90 minutes of speech therapy does not make it does not make a functional communication, right? You have to be practicing with those skills all day long. So if your speech therapist can put in some things, some information in the portfolio telling you specifically things that they are working on, you can then as a teacher roll that in and incorporate it within your day and across the day. So it's not just in the speech environment, it's not just in your classroom, but it's also at lunch and at PE and at recess. Another thing to look at is for service providers is to ensure students who are in wheelchairs are getting out of their wheelchairs enough throughout the week. We have related service providers fill out these forms, put them in the student portfolio as well as in this, program data books. And it's just a quick look-see at what we're working on every single day. Involving the family. So there's forms in there to involve the family, to ask them which way do they prefer to be communicated with. Do they prefer emails or phone calls? And it also for them to provide information about how things go at home, or what the student's favorite items are, or what the student likes to work for at home. And, sure, use the same thing for the student to work for at school. And it just helps build that bridge. And I'm sure we all have, everybody has those pieces already. This is just a way to formalize it and put it in portfolios so providers have the access to it to see what works with the student and what doesn't work. We talked about student portfolio forms. All forms can be easily modified to meet individual district needs. And I know I've said this a number of times, but there are some districts who maybe have had some court issues or cases involving communication with home. And some districts are pretty particular about any forms you're sending home. And so you might want to check with your administrators about the portfolios, especially the portfolio forms you'll be sending home to share for the family to share back and forth. And forms can easily be filled out electronically or by hand. I don't recommend you use every single form in this portfolio when you're initially putting them together, because it'll be overwhelming. I've seen a lot of districts kind of flip through and say, okay, we're going to use these 5 forms to start with, or these 3 forms to start with. And their expectation is when you initially start putting that portfolio together that you incorporate those 3 forms or 5 forms or whatever they decide. And then as you get more comfortable and you get the program up and running, then you can start adding those other forms in. But like I said, also some districts, depending on what's been going on in the courts or with cases, want to approve forms before they're sent home. So that might involve having the administrators sign up, the special ed administrators sign up and say, yeah, this is good to go home. Or it might even involve a lawyer looking at it saying, yeah, I don't recommend this, or this form is great, but we need to modify it this way. So hence we have it on the thumb drive that you can modify these forms to meet you, your student, and your district's needs.